Okay, we're going over Jake Wagner's Nebraska Hall of Fame tournament. First game is John Hartman, 1726 versus Jacob Wagner. White plays d4. We have a normal Indian defense move order. White plays knight f3 and black goes for d5. Playing for likely what is a Catalan or Queen's Gambit. White does play g3. Expected for this move order, I would say. And then black takes on c4, immediately going to an open style Catalan. Other options, I think, are not necessarily superior. So this is the main line. D takes c4, queen a4 check was played. Queen a4 check, of course, is more unusual here. I would think bishop g2 is most common. But queen a4 check, nevertheless, has been played by some strong players. It's a, I think, less ambitious move. In the other lines, white might play a gambit style game. So here black plays knight on b to d7. This seems to be the best move. c6 would likely transpose to a kind of Slav gambit line with g3. And that's playable with the queen on c4 being kind of misplaced. If you like this type of line, looks like this is a viable alternative. But knight on b d7, probably superior. And now white will get the pawn back at some point. He doesn't have to take it right away. As we see here, bishop g2, a6, queen takes c4. There's an unusual move in that white could play knight to c3, and that's probably worth looking at. Karpov Piano 2007. Knight c3, and black plays either rook b8 or bishop e7. But this is definitely the main line. Queen takes c4. And so here you have b5 versus c5. You played the normal move, I would say. Of course, it's possible to play c5. I would imagine that black would perhaps come close to equalizing with this move. We can check what the engine says. Just the tiniest advantage to white after c5. But I think the b5 is more complex. You're achieving a dynamic position, getting the bishop to b7, and that bishop is the problem developmentally, so this is good. Queen c6 down by white obviously is not forced, but it does save time, so the alternatives are more passive. Queen c6, exposing the queen to attack. And now the question is, importantly, whether black should play rook b8 or rook a7. And I don't think that it's easy to answer this question. At b8, the rook on b8 could be attacked by a future bishop f4, whereas at a7, it can always be attacked by perhaps a bishop at e3. Either way, the rook is a little bit exposed to potential attack in the long run, but I think that's what you should be thinking about. The advantage of rook a7, obviously, is that it protects the c7 pawn from a7. But I think the rook is a little more unusually placed at a7, probably fine to get back into the game. I think this move is okay. It's been played by strong players, David Navarra, for example. But let's say rook b8 is a bit more natural. The question is, how does black respond if the f4 pawn is attacked immediately with bishop f4? Common Catalan theme. So black has a bunch of different options here. Knight d5, bishop b4 check, or bishop to b7. But I think bishop to b7 is the most interesting, because this move would offer a sacrifice for the initiative. Bishop b7, queen takes c7, queen takes c7, bishop takes c7, rook c8, or bishop b4 check. With bishop b4 check, it looks like black has the best chances. Bishop b4 check. But I do think that maybe black's winning chances are limited here. There are some wins, though. As recently as 2023, Imre Hera has a game here against Drenchev. Knight on bd2, rook c8, and then bishop f4. Black is down a pawn with a strong kind of counter initiative. So that should be considered. But in any case, I think that rook a7 was okay. I'm not sure if you're still in book at this point. but now white plays castles, and then we see Wojtkiewicz and Rogers from 1993. No, like really modern games. Anna Zatonska versus Kobian. Um, Now black plays bishop b7. This is an interesting position because the engine doesn't want to play bishop b7 automatically. It is essentially a kind of automatic move. You want to achieve c5, and I would think like that would be absolutely natural, and most players did what you did. The computer, which is very good at finding quiet moves like bishop d6, and here it could get very complicated after bishop e3, perhaps causing problems with your rook on a7. So while it's interesting to look at ideas like this, I think what you did again is absolutely the most natural and correct. So bishop b7, queen c2, and then c5. This is the move that we just cannot afford to not, I would say, not play, essentially, in the Catalan. So now white caved, if you will, with the move d takes c5. Black isn't really necessarily threatening anything, so it isn't necessary for white to take on c5, effectively enabling black's development. The computer likes the combative a4 and also bishop e3, which is unusual, but we can see it was played by Ken Rogoff in 1978. So this is definitely an interesting move. The bishop would move again if attacked, of course. Knight d5, and then bishop somewhere. But the engine prefers the novelty bishop d2. So I think this leaves white with a slightly easier position to play, but black should be pretty much close to equal after destroying the center. Pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, close to equal. It might be hard for either side to win in this type of structure with symmetrical structure, and that's a problem that we run into, I think, in the open Catalan. You're often ending up in the essentially completely symmetrical structure. Black here does have a bunch of wins, which is interesting and a bit surprising. But again, d takes c5 is not a good move. So bishop takes c5, and now black has a bit of an initiative in terms of quick development. Pressure on f2. White plays this sort of typical Catalan move, and oddly Wojtkiewicz played it. But I don't think in a vacuum white wants to give up the bishop. A common strategy in the Catalan is to trade off the bishop for the knight and then trade the light square bishops and end up in a knight versus bishop type position. White square knight versus dark square bishop. Sounds familiar. So, but anyways, I would be concerned about my queen knight getting that into the game here. So difficult to say white should do a3, something like that looks reasonable. Kishpal versus Bondi Mészáros, 1996, two pretty good Hungarian IMs. White played a3 and black was slightly better. All right, bishop g5, and now you followed Ian Rogers here with queen b6, which is the most dynamic move. You also have ideas of queen a8, but queen b6 puts pressure on f2, which is not a secret at this point. There could be some a4, a5. You have to watch for knight c3, knight a4. That won't happen if your b pawn's on b5, obviously. But now white played knight to c3, and this is a new move. Wojo played bishop takes f6. This is completely unambitious play by Wojtkiewicz, and I don't know. I guess he was just counting on it being a draw against another strong grandmaster. But basically, he has nothing here after bishop takes f6. Knight takes f6. So the game ended in a draw, white not getting any advantage. After knight c3, white furthers development, but I would argue that oftentimes knight d2 might be superior to go to b3 in some cases. And it does stop bishop e4. You don't have b4 because of knight a4 type ideas. Castles, and now h3, which obviously passive move by white, but with a very concrete idea behind it, stopping the idea of knight to g4. This is a standard type of passive game by white. How else can white solve the problem of f2? Well, I guess he could simply play something like Wojtiewicz's bishop takes f6, and then prepare to play e3. This is what Wojo did. He played e3. Rather than playing h3, which really essentially doesn't solve the problem of the weak pawn at f2, Wojtkiewicz plays e3, puts his pawns on dark squares. He understands how to play the white side of the Catalan. He was slightly worse, being able to make a draw against Ian Rogers in what was most likely 1993 New York Open, or possibly an Olympiad. So h3, bad move. Rook c8, good. Queen d3, and then we have h6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and white plays rook a d1. And your problem here is, again, how to win in a position where it's a completely symmetrical structure. And I think it's not an easy question. You have bishop versus knight, which is good, some imbalance, but still without really white having clear weaknesses. Okay, f2. I think he should still probably play e3. So watch what happens at this point. You really want to connect the rook here laterally at some point with rook a7, but this is fine. You also give your queen a retreat square back to a8, a7. I think white's next move is terrible. e4, might even call it like a game-losing move. Because, again, Wojtkiewicz playing e3, keeping his structure on dark squares, it's very hard for black to win after that. With this catastrophic weakening of the dark squares, it looks like a bad Mora gambit or something like that. Just total dark square weaknesses with no compensation. And now he's tied down to f2. So I think this is a pivotal moment. I mean, if white doesn't do that, it could be hard for black to make progress. I mean, one idea, obviously, is to play against the white queen. You're going to start harassing the white queen, but he's going to go back and probably try to mass exchange rooks. And I think after something like e3, you'd have good chances for white to get a draw, possibly even queen e2, which is a favorite of Wojtkiewicz. But this is a really bad move, e4. You've got to be happy to see that. And you immediately played to undermine the e4 pawn, which I don't think is a no-brainer. But it looks like it's pretty strong. If I could play e5, that would be a consideration, fixing the pawn at e4, but there's no way to tactically justify this that I can see. You could try something like e5, knight takes e5, bishop d4, similar to the game, but this bishop is not protected. So we have to go to b4, okay? And now white can play e5. And I think that this we need to address. What's happening here? Bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and then the c pawn is categorically weak here. We're probably going to be picking off a pawn directly at some point, and white doesn't have any counterplay. Notice the h6 pawn, very important, controlling g5. So either way, white is in big trouble. He plays knight d2, and I think this is good. Takes. Now you have a concrete structural weakness on the queen side, and white is still somewhat weak in the dark squares with f2. He needs to play maybe king h2 and get off the f2 weakness. At this point, there's also e5, possibly. So your move queen c5 is a double threat in a sense, or double purpose move, controlling e5, attacking c3. And rook c1 now, bad placement for that rook. Rook d8 to get the other rook in the game, likely. Queen e2 now. I would consider at this point playing e5 because you have an ideal pawn there on a dark square, fixing his e4 pawn and taking away the d4 square from his knight. It'd be interesting to check, see what the computer thinks about this position. It looks like your move is best, rook a c8. So is e5 not an issue? Rook a c8. If white plays e5, we have bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and he would be able to simplify. This obviously is an option, check, knight f3, but I think it might be a better try for white than what happened in the game. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2, knight d7, and it looks like he has to try to hang on to the pawn. So f4 along these lines. And objectively, black is clearly better, but I'm not sure you can win by force. So that might be a better alternative. He plays instead knight b3, and now we're focusing on the weak pawn, knight d4, and you decide to go in endgame. I have no problem with that since you don't really have a kingside attack anyway. It's the static weakness that really matters here. So I think queen c4 is okay. Depending on the time, I don't think that your disadvantage, or rather your advantage, is decreasing because of a queen trade. This weakness on the queen side is very serious. So he can probably bring his king to the center now. So perhaps this isn't the most decisive way to play. But again, I would make my judgment deciding on this whether perhaps based on time. Now the knight's on d4. e5 is not really advisable with knight coming to f5. And trading queens against a weaker player is usually a safe procedure, but you could consider other moves. All right, white could also avoid trading queens, but no good square for the queen. So takes f3. This is a good development for white. Get his king to the center, deploy the bishop back to f1 later if he has time. Question is, does he have time? And it looks like b4 is too strong. So he underestimated this. And now knight e2, and you can penetrate. And you're probably winning. So at this point, white has the tactic pawn takes b4. Do we have anything else? And did we pull the trigger on this action too early? Would be my question. We want to act quickly while we have a chance to get active here. So that makes a lot of sense. But, okay, e5 needs to be considered. I see the f5 square, but at the same time, it may not present anything for white. He might even play knight b3 with the idea of knight a5. So let's check here with the engine. Rook d c8, focusing on c3. If e5, knight b3, with threats of knight a5, you're still better. It looks like this is actually the best move, tying him down to c3. After knight e2, what do? Do we play e5? Or just bring the king toward the center? Probably bring the king to the center. This looks overextended. Both sides would bring their respective kings to the center, and black is clearly better. Okay, so maybe that's a slightly better move. After this, sorry, b4. It's possible you played this too quickly, but we'll see. Because I don't like what happened here. Takes, you have to take on b4. For a moment, it looks like white has some chance to survive, but maybe this is a good judgment. Let's see. So rook f2, rook bb2. He has to play rook f2, rook bb2, and then bishop f1. He drops a clear pawn with rook takes a2. White still has some small chance to hang on here. So it's an interesting judgment whether b4 was too quick. Maybe you should be a bit more patient there, right? I assume it's time related. Knight c3, rook on bb2. Now we have close to winning position. This is very strong and obvious. And then he tries to trade pieces. He cannot defend, and obviously g4 is terrible for white. So you're winning. At this point, knight takes g3, rook takes b2, rook takes b2, rook b1. And now there don't seem to be any obvious tactics, so you took the easy endgame, which I agree with. Of course, we want to play this accurately. There is a possibility of g5, g5, king g2. If g5, king g2, king g7. he might play e5 and keep your king out of there, but you can come up to g6. So I think you're winning multiple ways here. King f8 might be a little slower in a sense. King e7, king d6, and then king f4 is obviously not going to save white, but he doesn't have any moves. There are too many threats for king infiltrating either way. So I think even king g3 was a bad move, essentially. He should probably just go to f2 and go to e3, or wait and see what you're going to do. The position is clearly lost for white. So, okay, we can wrap this one up. King d6 here, e5 check. That doesn't help white, and then self-mate. Okay. Next game, you're playing against Alekhine defense. We have a main line, and I think there's a lot to be said for the four pawns attack, which has seen some play lately. So that would be an alternate variation. Exchange variation is still good as well, but the problem there is this e takes, as always, like really kills the game. You end up with a sort of Petrov type of structure. Or Queen's, rather French exchange. I can't really recommend that line for an attacking player. Although black often takes the other way, and that leads to interesting games where white is better. I like Shaba's d5, and also the old line with knight c3, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7. But I just want to show this line with rook c1. Black has an interesting try after castles, b3. I don't know if you've seen this, but d5 here, and it's very interesting piece sacrifice for black. c5, and he sacks the knight on c6, knight c6, c takes b6, e5. Almost, it's an almost Rudolf Spielmann-like piece sacrifice. This might give black some chances in that line, rehabilitate it. There's a recent game, Fishbein. I hadn't seen this. This game has just appeared. Fishbein lost playing black, and I have no idea where that game was played. Okay, so back to normal Alekhine. Knight f3, black plays g6. This has always been one of black's best lines, but has been, always considered that knight g5, as you played in the game, is a main line. But I think after c6, castles, bishop g7, probably black's best chances there. So instead he plays knight b6, Spassky, Fischer, 1972, bishop b3, and then bishop g7. And now this, of course, is a well-known variation with knight g5. And I don't have any experience with either side of this, but it looks like there are alternatives. I mean, queen e2 looks like a steadier move. And I see Michael Adams and Nigel Short with white there. So this deserves to be, I think Adams' handling of the Alekhine in general is very good, this type of structure. Queen e2 must be a very strong move. Perhaps again a little steadier, but knight g5 is the main line. Black's supposed to play e6. It looks like e6 or d5, but instead plays castles, and this leads us into a very unusual situation, which has really almost never been played. And you would think that it must be terrible for black because there's only 2 games, but this is the kind of position that could really upset you, I think, in the opening. If you expect that this move can't be played for some reason, it turns out it's not that bad, and it's basically playable. Kojima couldn't beat 2200 here, but the reaction is critical. You're supposed to play e6, although an interesting alternative I found, which hasn't been tried, I think queen f3 in this position. is something that you should think about. If queen f3 e6, you have queen h3, and we transpose to a known variation. Black has to find a very, very good defense here, which is queen e8, and now e6, f6. And if knight h3, the game would remain complicated, but you have a knight f7 and b5, and it looks like white doesn't have better than immediate perpetual with knight h6 because the e6 pawn is hanging. You could try something like queen e2, but the pawn is looking overextended, so probably white has to take a draw or repetition. So nothing clear there, but again, this is a tough position. You have to find an idea. It looks like e6 is best and critical. And then oddly enough, in the one game where this game occurred, it looks like black should probably play f6. Again, allow knight f7, queen e8, complicated position. But white's better. You have h4, h5, a better version of the other game we just looked at. Obviously, after knight check here, we're not under any immediate threat of losing the e6 pawn. That's important. So queen f3 wasn't necessary. But strangely, Kojima played knight takes e6 check here, or rather knight takes e6, which is leaving white with just a very small edge. Bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, king h8, and black was able to survive. I mean, okay, clearly white is slightly better, and so he decided to play it simply and just didn't have the technique to win. But objectively, it looks like bishop takes, and black is in big trouble. This isn't a small advantage. We're playing for mate now with h4. So this looks really bad for black. h5 is just extremely weakening, so he should try the alternative, I guess. Perhaps something like rook f6, or maybe queen e8. Queen e8 I looked at, and here we have h5 anyway with a very strong attack. So this variation isn't good, but it's not easy to find the right line over the board. f4 oddly was played in another game, and you do transpose back after he plays e6, but he has better. He has d takes e5, d takes e5, f takes e5, c5, or h6. I looked at h6, c5 was played in this game, h6, and now knight e4, like a Pierce. And now black has difficulty getting in his freeing advance, but he has knight c6, c3, knight a5, typical Alyakian plan, bishop c2. And unbelievably, black can attack the center with f6. And although this looks horrible for black and unbelievable, it appears, according to the engine, that black is about equal. Not easy for black to find this. So f takes e6 takes, and I guess castles. And black's kingside looks a little shaky, but perhaps he can keep it under control. These three pawns can stay where they are, and black can hold his position together. After e6, though, you made a very strange decision to voluntarily retreat your knight from g5. And it doesn't appear clear to me why you did this. Black isn't threatening anything. Your knight's well protected. You should continue your development in some way. And I mean, there's more than one way to play this position. You can play more quietly for the space advantage or play for direct attack. h4, perhaps a bit over the top. So something steady like castles. And here's the game, Emil Anka, 1994. But, okay, knight e4, it does have an interesting point that you're stopping c5. The problem is this: takes, queen h4 check. Similar to what happened in the game, but a better version for black. This endgame may be safer for you to play this way, but objectively it looks like black might be okay here. Ostensibly, it looks like white is better, but there might be an element of overextension. Maybe something like bishop d7 with the idea of bishop c6, and black should be able to equalize. You have to play very carefully, but I guess it's about equal. So knight e4 inaccurate, and then a5, typical move. You played c3. I think this is a good reaction. Rather than automatically playing a4, give yourself this retreat of the bishop back here, defending the knight on e4. Let him play a4, fine. If he plays a4, that's fine. Doesn't really have any tricks with a3, so I think your knight could even go to a3 possibly. Let him overreach himself on the queen side. It's a good decision, and he does. Bishop c2, and then very surprisingly, black plays queen e4 check, and this is clearly not a great move. And you should play g3. Obviously, if he goes to h3, I'm not sure, maybe you didn't calculate it or see this particular move, bishop e4, so he can't go in. And this could just be miscalculation. Obviously, queen h6 is bad because of f5, so black has to go back, and everything's under control. Yes, your king side is slightly weakened, but your space advantage is not in dispute here. So white, I think, is clearly better. You should play g3. It's like a Benoni, where black does the provocative queen h4. But this is just slightly passive. So then black tries to go, I think, active with c5. That looks good. Castles. And so now you are feeling a little bit overextended. Bishop d7, and now back to e4. C takes d4. And here I'm not sure, but I liked knight takes d6. You can double check it. It looks like you can play either cd4 or knight takes d6. I like the fact that this move creates a little bit of imbalance, and allowing d takes c could further your development. On the downside, you lose your d pawn. But the following move I was surprised by, knight c8, and I didn't really like you exchanging this powerful knight on c8. I can see his knight getting back in the game, standard Alekhine. But I was hoping that white could find something better in this position. We can check. Knight e4. Knight e4 is interesting, keeping the pressure on. And then he has bishop b5. But I just don't really like exchanging the knight on c8, which feels like it releases black a little bit from the cramped position. This seems a pity to exchange that off, and I don't know how much your advantage really is with this extra pawn. Ostensibly, it looks like black has compensation for the extra pawn. He has really no bad pieces. He traded off kind of superfluous piece. There's possible bishop c6. He should be able to blockade the d5 square. There's some overextension. So I felt like you should have had more somehow, but this move may be like pushing too much for black, bishop e5. So it looks like bishop c6 is probably best. So I think he tries to go a little too far here. This doesn't really hurt you. I mean, obviously rook f3 would be a bit more active. This is safer. Knight c6. And this is the problem, of course. Black's play leaves him with this huge weakness set at b5. So he tries, I think, to over-combine. Your opponent is too reliant on tactics, trying to force things, and knight b4. Now, there's a mate idea, of course. After knight takes b5, knight takes c2, rook takes c2, rook takes c2, queen takes c2, and queen e1 mate. But the question is, does black have everything calculated out here? And he misses this intermezzo g3. I think your best was some combination of knight takes b5 and then g3. So knight takes b5, knight takes c2, and then g3. So you can time this in different ways. And here he would have had queen h5. You would have g4. He would like go back to h4. And now you take. Now he takes. Now you take. And now he takes your g4 pawn. And this is obviously scary and difficult to calculate. mean, especially if you don't have time. But likely white is winning. So let's see. Queen g2, queen d1, check, queen f1, queen c2. Or perhaps he checks you again, queen g4, check, king h1. But it looks like white should be able to consolidate and win. So maybe a little more calculation there if you had time. g3 is good as well. Maybe the second best move. And obviously should be good enough. Take, take. Interesting, knight takes b5. Knight takes c2, rook b1. You're still up a pawn. It's not so easy. Now, queen takes h5, g takes h5, and then bishop e4. Again, you played it safe. I would have probably played the same. You're a clear pawn up. But in this case, he no longer really has compensation. And I think that's the point. So after bishop c6, I like what you did. And, you know, he comes to his senses in a way with b takes, but maybe he shouldn't. He should do rather rook takes. Maybe he should do knight takes. Just let you play d5 and just accept being down a pawn. I'm not sure. Okay, pawn takes makes a lot of sense. This is what the computer wants to do. Stop d5 at all costs. You're still up a pawn, difficult endgame to convert. Your opponent plays rook takes, playing for active pieces. And now a3, which obviously we don't really want to have more pawns on dark squares. But it doesn't look like he has anything. So this just was a good conversion. Take, take. And then this move doesn't help him, but what else can he do? Yeah, really good, solid conversion. Ironically, all of your pawns on the wrong color, and this bishop is just sort of blotted out. So bishop f8, bishop takes a3 type tactic. You have knight e4. Black is only down one pawn with a bishop versus a knight. Yet he seems to be completely lost. So f6, king f2, king f7, king f3, and maybe black should consider playing f5, but there'd be no way to undermine your center after that. So he plays here, knight e4, and this is a huge square, obviously. So king e7, and then you took on f6. A concession structurally. And notice how strong your pawn chain was this whole game. Never was broken. You voluntarily broke your own pawn chain here. The pawn takes f6. But now his pawn on h7 is very weak. I think you played this game well. Knight takes f6, king takes f6, and then I expected rook to the h file at this point. But I think the text move is winning. Although you're cutting it close, you're really only winning because your rooks are so active, not because of the extra pawn necessarily. Rook takes d5. 4 against 3 is cutting it close. And I would anticipate black maybe playing like rook a6 or something. But you also have g4. So basically, good king, good pawn structure, active rooks. You have every factor in your favor. Therefore, you're winning. And that's obviously a tragedy for black. Maybe he could try another move here, but I don't see it. So rook b8, takes h7, b5, and then freezing him. And this is an easy win. Okay. So this game wasn't bad overall. Fairly easy win there with the pawns. And then against Nate Solon, opening is critical. I just want to say that I feel like, you know, he's making a mistake here by playing this Nimzovich variation against a low-rated player. Not sure it's a good idea. You're a bad choice because you know quite a bit of theory. Against a player who doesn't know any opening theory, maybe this is a good choice. But I think he's a stronger player, and he's really helping you by playing a kind of inferior variation. And to be honest, it's a practical mistake by black. He better off playing something completely strange. This is a little bit offbeat, but most people know it, and it's basically better for white. But anyways, after e5, knight d5, knight c3, knight takes c3 is pretty commonly played, and that might be black's best. I think this is the best chance. Takes, and then knight c6. I thought I saw some Rachmanov games, but it looks like mostly Duda. Here's a couple Rachmanov games. Navarro Rachmanov 2022. Black basically has a very durable position. He plays e6 and like b6 and bishop b7, often castles queenside. I think I like this better than the way that Nate Solon played. This is a tricky line, and it's not so easy. Let's see, bishop f4. So the Carlsen Grandelius here lost playing a fantastic, I mean, Carlsen played a fantastic game with queen b6, but this is a stupid move for black. You know, I don't know why black wants to do that. It seems like the normal variation with e6 is still pretty tough to crack. So you see all these games by Duda, Predke. This seems to be reliable for black. If he's going to play this opening, that's probably the best chance. And knight c7, I mean, come on, this is going too far. So although Solon's move is the main line, I think knight takes c3 is best. e6, and this is very easy to play. And you have the alternative knight e4 here, which is also interesting, kind of like a 4-knight Sicilian. But, you know, this is fine, and especially against a stronger player, just an easy line to play. So again, I think he makes a huge mistake. Black has very few wins in this type of position. d4, and then knight c6, and this is basically a tricky line where he's kind of baiting you into this trap that happened in the game. But I would give very serious consideration to just playing c3, and we can see here that it was played by Giri, so he lost. Giri and Mamajarov, Zoltan Almashi. It seems like a solid, safe way to play. I mean, it's like a French Tarash or something. So I put in a few moves, d6, or alternatively, like d6, bishop b5, or alternatively, c takes d. You know, perhaps you don't want to play this way against a weaker player, but against Solon or someone strong, I think, you know, the onus is on him to do something. And after c3, only white could be a tiny bit better. It's a very safe line. This is riskier. So if you don't really know it, I would stay away from it. I mean, fundamentally, you're helping black develop to try to grab a pawn. And you can see there's a ton of Mamajarov games here. But these guys know the theory extremely well. Fundamentally, taking on c5, winning the pawn at d5, it's like a trappy line for black. So now d6, and that may be better than queen b6. Probably queen b6 is the older move. It feels like white's still better, but you have to be careful not to lose easy to lose the initiative here. So again, we're responding to black. Pawn takes pawn, now the bishop's hanging. So yes, queen b6, we're kind of forced into this complex line. And now you didn't know the move. I didn't know the move, and most people don't know the move. It's apparently queen e4 check. Anand knows the move. Ding Liren knows the move. But again, very touch and go type position where you have to be accurate. And this is exactly the kind of trap that black was really hoping for. So I think a lot needs to be thought about in terms of opening, you know, choices based on who you're playing, how strong they are, what their style is. Solon was lucky that you didn't play something solid like c3, and it would have been a very different game. Now you have to be extremely accurate, but you played bishop c4. This still might be okay. Bishop takes f2 check, king f1, castles. But, you know, you immediately went astray here in this chaos. And I'm not surprised. I think that anybody could go astray here. It's a very, very unnatural type position. But honestly, your instinct should be like, this is I'm going too far. You don't have any development. Most of your pieces are on the back row. Your king's on f1 in an open position, and you grab the pawn or two. Um, alarm bells should be going off in a practical sense. This is acerbate from my stream type of move. If you don't know the theory of this position, it's hard to find this, but oddly enough, queen b5 basically forces a trade of queens. So queen b5, bishop e6, queen takes b6, and then bishop takes b6. And now white even won a game with bishop b3. We should probably check this with the computer. It does look like it's slightly better, but the funny thing is that the Cantan's game, Soko played correctly, bishop takes e6, f takes e6. So this is only valuable for black if he can play e5, e4 and open up the f file. e2. Curious that Soko lost with white. In such a simplified endgame, it's almost unbelievable. He probably overpressed, but rook d8, now rook d1. Basically, he played perfectly. Black plays e5. As I said, the only chance would be to open this up. And I don't understand how white goes on to lose this game. Bishop takes e3. He played like a perfect game. It's unbelievable. And then loses this endgame after rook f6. So if you can play like Bartosz Sako, you've been fine. But again, Solana is banking on this opening being kind of trappy, and you're not Bartosz Sako. So I think I would, if I don't know the theory, I'm going back to c3 and playing fundamentally, play solidly here. Don't develop the opponent's pieces for them. I think that d takes c5 is really a risky move, and leave that to the 2600s. Okay, so anyway, we get caught in this situation where you miscalculated, and ironically, Solana didn't find the best move. He found like the second best move with bishop e6. So bishop h4 is winning by force. It's really nasty. This happened in a game, sort of women's tournament in 2021. Queen e2, knight e5, queen f4, knight g6, queen d2, and then bishop g4. Now white is just getting murdered in his bed, or her bed. Can't get out, and white is just lost. So unsurprising, but you had a little break here with bishop e6. And so you may still be lost, but it's not nearly as devastating as bishop h4. So you were lucky in that sense. Queen e4, bishop takes c4 check, queen takes c4, and then rook a e8, which looks like it was another minor inaccuracy by Solana. Isn't quite bloodthirsty enough here. He's playing kind of routinely. Bishop f4. And you also have another move that I went over here. Maybe you can improve. And the line I put in was this. You're obviously close to lost, but you have a pawn, you have some activity, and you can guard against this threat. So knight f3. Black has this tactic, knight d4. This would be very hard to see. King f2 is too dangerous. Knight takes allows rook e1 check. So you have to find an absolutely amazing move, bishop f4. And then after this, knight f4, pawn f4, bishop h4, you're able to survive. And actually, he has to be careful. So after bishop g3, he's got to grab that pawn. Takes, queen takes d6. And now you're still worse. I would say black's still clearly better and still has chances to win, but it looks like it might be holdable with perfect defense. I gave a line here in the analysis. Queen d3, take, and then the rook ending. this is very close, obviously. Okay, so bishop f4, like second best move here. Now your last chance. Obviously, mate is threatened, so maybe you missed this. You want to put the knight on f3, not on h3. On h3, your knight is, the knight is on a bad square, defending against his mate. So that's really what we wanted to avoid with knight f3. Effectively, your move order was bad. Yeah, so he's close to winning, and this is your last chance at all. It looks like. If you trade queens, you're okay, obviously. Bishop f6, queen b3. He avoids the exchange of queens, and remember, he's a pawn down. So rook d1, queen f5, again threatening to trade queens, giving up this pawn here, and then again trying to trade queens. Queen takes b2, and this is the best I come up with. Knight g5, bishop takes g5, bishop takes g5. And probably you're losing, but there's still some symbolic chance. But g3 loses immediately, and obviously this is over because he has this, and then there's just too many weaknesses in your position. Queen c6, f3, and your d pawn, though it looks good, isn't really able to do anything. So I don't know what you could possibly do. Queen e4, queen d5 allows knight g4. So queen e4 is a better chance, stopping knight g4, objectively. But after queen takes pawn, just simply queen takes pawn. Your king is wide open in the middle game, and he has a good queen and knight combination. You can't really connect your rooks. So the situation is still probably lost. But queen d5 is the last straw. Obviously, after this, it's over. And nothing you can do. His mating attack was quite accurate. A very nice game. Okay, and then the final game. Overall, you played fairly well, but I see a sense of rustiness. So you don't play enough, maybe OTB. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and then knight c3. And you're playing a low-rated player here. So I think like the ideal would be to really have more than one system that you play. I'm not sure that playing the semi-Tarrasch against low-rated players is great. But on the other hand, you can play it, just in a different way, I guess, depending on the move order. White hasn't played e3 yet, so after c5, you could play a regular Tarrasch. But I think something like the Rogozin, or if you want to play the Queen's Gambit for a win, then maybe a secondary line. A lot of people have been playing the a6 type of lines. This has been very popular. It's easy to learn. That's one suggestion. Also, knight on bd7, of course. You could play Vienna variation or Cambridge Springs. And then finally, of course, the Rogozin. But c5, objectively, it's a great move, but it's really a good move, especially against stronger players trying to play a solid game. If he plays e3, you can get a dynamic game, maybe, but after this, e takes d, going back in the Tarrasch, of course, is playable. There's also c takes d4. I don't know if this is a better try or not, but anyway, a main line, White plays e4, and that's the thing that we're most afraid of because we're being forced to trade pieces. Takes, and then c takes, check. This is a great line, but again, not against 1700. Bishop takes d2, queen take, castles. And so now, theory has changed on this line a lot. Traditionally, bishop c4 was always the move, and White was always considered to be better, but then Black modified the way they played with the use of computers. Knight c6 has gone away, and we've seen it replaced by these more flexible knight d7 and b6 type systems. It looks like knight d7 is the best there, and it's very hard for white to get much. Potentially you could even win with the queenside majority, but that's really like kind of a theoretical thing that rarely happens. But this guy plays bishop e2. I mean, bishop d3 is a more active move. Rook c1. This is a major move too. I think this move has been seen quite a bit on a fairly high level. Even rook d1 is a move. But bishop e2 is totally unassuming. And the problem with it is that it doesn't put any pressure on your position. It also doesn't protect his center in any way. And I think there's nothing wrong with what you did, but you have to remember this bishop is placed relatively passively compared to, say, d3 or c4. So his kingside attacking chances are not that great immediately. And the question is, are we going to routinely do the same plan that's in the chessable or whatever against bishop e2? So maybe the knight c6 is better here, would be my argument. Something to consider. But it looks like b6 is the best. So, whereas against bishop c4, knight d7, here we go b6. And now after castles, you can play bishop b7, attacking his pawn at e4 and delaying your knight from b8. So now he could play like in the game with queen f4. And that's probably where you got the queen f6 idea, by the way, in the game. But this looks more solid, queen e3. And so I think at the end of the day, you can't be dogmatic. So you have to be thinking about playing appropriate to what the opponent did, not like just playing knight d7 by routine. It looks like knight c6 is the best here. Classically speaking, that's what black usually used to do in this variation. And it's a more active square where we can put pressure on this pawn and obviously go out to a5 in some cases. Rook fd1. So I put in the Nakamura Dingley-Ren here in my notes. Nakamura Dingley-Ren Moscow Grand Prix 2017. h4 novelty, rook c8, h5, h6, rook d1, queen e7, here, 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 here. That's another more rare but interesting idea. And then rook c2, black equalized in the Dingley-Ren game. So I just want to say that you need to keep your options open with the knight move, depending on what white does. It looks like bishop e2 is kind of lame. Notice the statistics are black actually has a plus score against bishop e2, probably because most of the people who play bishop e2 are weaker players, Nakamura being kind of the exception rather than the rule. But you played to transpose with knight d7, castles, b6, and now you don't have as active of a knight. And then this move is obviously very bad for white. So white doesn't know what he's doing. The bishop on e2 doesn't seem to really contribute anything to white's position. It just sort of stays out of the way. I mean, I could imagine there could be some kind of odd sort of bishop d1 maneuver. Rook fe1. Here's Bent Larsen versus Pano. Bishop b7. And Larsen actually played bishop d3 at tempo down. But Farkas Ricard, no, this is a reasonable move as well. But white has nothing. But this is horrific. Of course, he's not set up for this yet. And he played perfectly. Knight c5. And now all he did was trade off his front pawn in the center. Doesn't make a ton of sense. D takes c6. Bishop takes c6. And now the things get interesting. So we actually have one game in the Opening Explorer where white played the exact same move. Queen f4. I don't think that white necessarily has to avoid exchanges of queens, but the queen is most active on this square. Trading queens brings your rook to the center. So I thought this was a very interesting position, and hard for black to say what to do. And it turns out that your move, oddly enough, was like the engine's #1 suggestion. So this move deserves some credit as like an exclamation point, really. Because in this type of endgame, your passive side, it doesn't matter that you have double pawns. It's like an exchange Roy Lopez. They stop the enemy pawns from queening. That's all they need to do. Whereas on the queen side, you have the healthy majority. So you're better. But I don't know, objectively, you should consider other moves as well. Queen e7 as played in the other game, knight d4. So another advantage of queen f6 is you stop the knight d4. You can only play that if he exchanges queens. But again, you have to ask yourself, do I want to trade queens against the 1700? Takes, and then e5, he immediately tries to liquidate his center. And now you got to win based on the queenside majority. Here is an interesting position. It's possible you could drop the pawn on f6. I didn't really look at this, but even this move, for example, grabbing the open file, pawn takes, and knight e4, we get our pawn back, is to be considered. But I think king g7 is okay. Also okay is taking, but you might have been afraid of stuff like this. It doesn't look like he has anything. All right, so e5, I don't think there's anything to be seriously considering. f5, that's probably a mistake. So king g7, and then a4. And this is a really bad move. He's trying to trade the pawn off, but he's not going to get to. And that's the point. Like he tried to trade off his whole center. He played d5, traded it off, e4, traded it off. Now a4 is going to trade it off, but you're not going to let him. If he doesn't play a4, he should play pawn takes pawn, king takes. Your king is good, and you're slightly better. But can you win this position objectively? The problem is not right away, but he should play a3 in some moment. That's where the pawn should go. So knight d4. I think you should preserve your bishop. You don't have to, but I think you should. Very strongly consider it. It's tough to call. Maybe not. Maybe rook f d8. And objectively, this type of ending should be a draw almost every time. So you got to consider bishop e7, freezing the a pawn. He may go for exchanges. Bishop e5, and it's going to be tough to beat him, but it's possible. So a4, horrible move, allowing this, freezing his pawn, and then you're better now, and you got a chance to beat this lower rated player in the endgame. Rook b1, and back rank mates, of course, but not immediately with bishop f1. So knight a5, and the engine doesn't like knight a5. Rook c3 is tough to play. It looks like you're pinning yourself. So it's difficult to criticize your play here. Maybe this move, rook f d8, was a little deeper, and then takes, takes, check, and then you obviously have, rook f, rook d1. So perhaps that would have been best. A little more calculation here. Knight a5, knight d4. He's hanging on. I don't mind rook f d8, but again, the argument about keeping pieces on the board against a low-rated player, you're also probably concerned about this. But in the vacuum, bishop d7 has to be considered. Bishop d5 has to be considered. Here he has this. Trading the light square bishop seems like a pity because it was the better bishop, essentially. So I think all cases, it's probably drawish now. But your decision to trade this off may be slammed by some players because he has the bishop against knight and pawns on both sides of the board. I don't think it's that bad, but it's probably definitely better for white. Your pawns are split over here. You're going to lose against Bobby Fischer for sure. Rook e3, rook d4, and you're getting active here, here, here. And this is a mistake. So it looks like you can outpost your knight on c5. This is best. Before he has time to double and pressure you. Now your rook is tied down defensively. Check. And then, of course, we would prefer to stay on e7, but you lose the h pawn, so this is a disaster. h3, a very bad move, taking away his own rook mobility. And now you traded rooks, which is fine. So I think here's the critical moment for white, where, that's an important asset where he can attack you with rook h3. He just dogmatically created back rank luft. But he could have played for rook c3. So white played too safely. It's a draw. But now his king is pushed to the side. Knight b7, you find the knight maneuver. Here, here. And now, of course, if he could play a5, it should be played. And considering the way he played the game earlier, it's very odd that he didn't play this. No, he did. Okay, a5, yeah. Yeah, he's been trying to trade pawns the whole game, basically playing for a draw. He does find a5, rook b1, a takes b, and now bishop c6, king f6, king g3, and then you're holding on 3 against 3. And this is a very good move, I think. To evaluate f4 check. Now your king walks down into the middle of the board. Looks like white can never possibly lose, even with your king centralized, but that king could support these pawns, especially the b pawn. I think white has a sense it's like an unlosable position, playing too hard for a draw. King f3. Yeah, he could have cut you off with rook c4. King f3, king d4, great move. For the first time in the game, you're better. Or second time in the game, let's say. And then rook a3, and now b5. And now the pawn, it almost plays itself. And this has suddenly became very hard for white to hold on because your pieces are so coordinated. He's basically got to sacrifice his bishop for the pawn. It's unbelievable. So good job. Getting winning chances essentially out of nowhere. He goes to the pawn, b3, bishop e8. Now he's lucky if he can sack the bishop for it. If he could sack the bishop for it, he could probably draw. So I don't know, that's going to be a blocker with e4. At some point, this is a very good move as well, cutting him off and strengthening e4. And I know that d7 is covered and b7 is covered. And now e4 check and you're winning. So good job beating the weaker player when you're supposed to in equal ending. Okay, that's it. All right, good games overall. It seems like you need to do a little bit more calculation. Perhaps think a bit more about your opening repertoire and playing specifically thinking more about whether you're playing a higher rated or low rated player in particular games, what opening you're going to play, and maybe differentiating that. Otherwise, okay, not bad. Thanks for the games, and I'll talk to you later. Bye bye.